there's other things that we need, included besides protein. We'll also get to carbohydrates and fats, but there's things like vitamins and minerals that we need. Vitamins are essentially cofactors. What they do is they're molecules that act as coenzymes. In other words, they attach to specific enzymes so that then those enzymes function correctly. So by definition, we can't synthesize vitamins or minerals. Vitamin D is a conditional vitamin in that we can actually get, if we stay out in the sun a lot, we can get a fair amount of it. Okay? But everything else we need to actually get from our food. That's why, anybody know what scurvy is?
I'm not too sure what it is, but it's something like that.
Bad, okay. What about you? Scurvy?
You know that sailors get it?
Yeah, okay, good.
It's when you don't have enough vitamin C in your diet?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So one of the problems that it turns out during long sea voyages in the past, there were basically 3 foods that they fed sailors in the old days. Hardtack, which was this really non-leavened kind of biscuit. Salt pork, I love that. And then, let's see, grog. You know what grog is? The fermented beverage. Fermented beverages are good. They help you through tough times. And if you were shanghaied off of a wharf in some, port, and you had 3 years on a ship and not being able to get off, then you need a lot of grog to make it through. Okay, now, unfortunately, none of those 3 things provide vitamin C. So, sailors would often get scurvy. And you can find vitamin C in citrus, different kinds of fruits, and normally you get it in your diet, you're fine. Very rarely do you see people today getting scurvy in modern societies unless they have a metabolic problem. But they do occasionally. But in those old days, oh God, you got cognitive troubles, your gums bleed, you ache all over. It's kind of a miserable disease. Easily fixed, but they didn't know it. But eventually there was a medical officer on board one of these voyages in the British Navy, and I don't know what it was, but he seemed to, I think it was an observation that sailors that actually had access to citrus didn't get scurvy. And so that's why British sailors became known as limeys, okay? Because they were given an extra food source, which is limes. They could keep for a long time. They'd suck on the limes, no scurvy. Okay. But it was noticed beforehand, so I don't know the exact history, but that's the basic idea. So here we are with vitamin C, scurvy dog. Collagen is a connective tissue protein, and so that's kind of why you basically fall apart without vitamin C. So you can't make correct form of collagen without vitamin C. So your connective tissue becomes weak, skin becomes rough, teeth loosen, scurvy dog, Lyme strong. Okay, yeah. Okay. I guess it's International Scurvy Day is May 2nd. Something to look forward to. Similarly, now there's a bunch of different vitamins. There's a whole bunch of different B complex vitamins, thiamine, and a bunch of them. And if you don't get those, you have other problems. There's another one that, let's see, I forget what it is, but rickets is another vitamin shortage disease. Minerals, what's in hemoglobin? Anybody have an idea? That's what carries oxygen in the blood? Iron, right. So, we need iron in our diet. We get it from our food. I guess you could probably chew on iron, and now it's not very soluble actually, yeah.
This doctor, I think, solving a problem they had in Africa with iron.
Mm-hmm.
He made a little iron fish for those people to boil their water in.
Oh, really? And that's how they got enough, okay.
That's their source of iron. So,
oh, interesting.
So we're not.
Cool. That's nice, okay. You learn something every day. So, make sure you get enough iron. People who have anemia, they usually don't have enough iron. So, oftentimes you'll have, let's say, someone who's got low red blood cell count. They'll often have low hematocrit, which is hemoglobin, the heme group, and hemoglobin as well. And it's all because of a lot of it is because of the iron. There's a lot of other minerals, enzymes, minerals with a charge, like hydroxyl, which is OH, has a negative charge. Hydrogen with a positive charge, that means no electron, that's a cation. An anion is an ion with a negative charge. So what happens is these tend to set up gradients between positive and negative, and a lot of times you can get things to, transport across membranes because of these gradients, but sometimes you actually need certain ions to make that happen. So we have magnesium, potassium, chlorine, certain minerals, calcium for bone formation, and phosphorus, another one. So these are essential minerals. All the minerals that we need, even in very small quantities, are essentially, well, they're essential. We can't make them. So it has to come from our diet. Anybody hear about antioxidants? Okay, so what do antioxidants do? You just answered it. They neutralize free radicals. So free radicals are essentially ions with a charge that are very reactive. Before refrigerants were controlled, we were getting an ozone hole. And it was because of usually chlorines and various things that were used in refrigerants. They get up into the atmosphere and they react with ozone high in the atmosphere. Okay, so those are kinds of free radicals. Well, it turns out we in our metabolic processes, there are a lot of things that create free radicals. It is thought that free radicals, because they're so highly reactive, that they might cause problems. And so we might get a lot of antioxidants that kind of neutralize them from veggies and things that are rich in vitamins. Yes?
Can beta-carotene cause cancer?
Beta-carotene? I haven't heard it, but why?
I was just...
Well, where do you hear it? In what context? Do you remember? Okay. Let's see. Beta-carotene. It's one of the yeah.
So what does it neutralize again?
Antioxidants neutralize free radicals.
Free radicals.
Yeah. Okay. Which are highly reactive chemicals, like free radical chlorine ion is highly negatively charged, and so it often binds very quickly with other chemicals that can kind of cause problems. Okay? The only thing I heard about beta-carotene is that I think it's in carrots, actually, in high amount. And years and years ago, I lived in Rome, and there was the Daily American. It was actually a CIA paper, just so you know. But they would have all these stories, and one of the stories was about this guy in the Netherlands who was a health freak, and he ended up drinking gallons and gallons of carrot juice a day, and he turned orange, and then he died. But who knows? I don't know. Anyway, I don't know if there's actually, it sounds good. The trouble with nutrition in general, everything you read about nutrition is that it's wrong. Okay? Recently, they used to give this pyramid food group, lots of vegetables and all that kind of stuff, low fats, special animal fats, all that. Okay. Well, they recently came up, they finally did some real experiments, and actually a high-fat diet, we get most of our cholesterol, well, we get some of our cholesterol from diet, but very little dietary cholesterol that we actually eat from, let's say, meats and things like that, actually ends up in our circulating cholesterol. Most of our cholesterol is made in the liver. Okay? Now, so nutrition has historically been, well, it seems plausible, so we'll say, don't eat this and do eat that. There's a movie that, anybody know who Woody Allen is? Okay. There's an old movie called Sleepers. It's about a guy who, he's terrified of dying, so his body is frozen solid, and then he's hoping that later on he'll get woken up in the future and they'll be able to cure him, and they do. And he's from New York, and in one of the scenes, the doctors are talking about, diet and all that, and they said, oh yeah, back in those days it was thought that, red meat was really bad for you, which we now know is absolutely important. All the things that we thought were bad were actually good, okay? So, we don't actually know necessarily that these antioxidants are actually bad for us. It's been an assumption. It has not necessarily been tested. Now, I wouldn't go out and start imbibing lots of free radicals, but nutrition is not really a science. It's not really a science at this point. It's been a just-so story. There's some real scientific evidence behind it, but a lot of it isn't. So, just so you know, this idea about health foods and all that, taking vitamins is probably not going to hurt you. But they have found in some studies that people who were given vitamins compared to people who got their vitamins from vegetables and stuff compared to people who didn't have vitamins, that actually the people who ate vegetables were actually healthier. And that vitamins by themselves, some vitamins actually are toxic at certain levels. So just so you know, the multivitamin industry is probably a scam. Okay? Now, you may live in a part of the world where you don't have a good diet, where you're vitamin deficient. But I guarantee you, anybody who's living in this country for the most part, it probably gets more than enough vitamins in their diet without having to resort to multivitamins. Okay? Just so you know that. One of the things the nutritionists have decided now that perhaps fats aren't actually all that bad for you. They certainly have lots of calories, but eating butter compared to, let's say, margarine, probably will not have any effect on your health. The only thing it will affect is that butter is much more savory than margarine. Okay? It's as simple as that. So if you want to keep eating margarine, go ahead. I'm eating butter. Now, then we have, of course, looks like a nice gravy with animal fats in it. Something, if you drank that, would you fall asleep? Probably not. Okay. Anyway, we need fats, though, in our diet. Unfortunately, we also turn carbohydrates into fats, part of our metabolic process. And there's this whole metabolic syndrome, of which weight gain, extra fat, cardiovascular disease, diabetes is all part of that syndrome. And it's absolutely a metabolic disease of modern society. In the past, when our ancestors underwent periodic famines, having the alleles that under a diet that's you can eat all you want might cause diabetes, under those starvation conditions, having those alleles actually protect you and get you through a famine, whereas someone who's skinny all the time, you can only get so skinny before you die, right? Now, we've talked about fats a little bit earlier. I said the phospholipid bilayer. So fats are very important. Not only do we store them, but we use them in the way our cells the cell membrane is made. They're very important. Lipids and fats, they're the same thing. So why do we use fatty acids besides just energy? So here's the cell membranes. We use them in, we make a bunch of steroidal compounds, usually from our liver, that incorporate fats. Cholesterol actually is not necessarily bad. High levels of cholesterol circulating in the bloodstream is probably bad for you, depending on if some people have a kind of a mutant cholesterol that doesn't cause a problem. But cholesterol is often used to make, help proteins function properly. In this phospholipid bilayer that keeps, so here's the fatty tail here, and then here's the fat. So it keeps the water out from outside the cell and keeps all the stuff inside the cell there. Now, we talked about amino acids before. Well, we can synthesize most fatty acids from scratch, but those that we cannot synthesize from scratch, what are those called? Essential. Good. Essential fatty acids, just like essential amino acids, those you have to get from your diet. This is where some of this is not necessarily true. So there's different kinds of fatty acids and fats, and we can say that they're saturated fats or unsaturated fats. Saturation makes for straight chains that pack together easily, and at room temperature tend to be a solid, like butter. Unsaturated fats tend to kink and are actually liquid at room temperature for the most part, like olive oil or vegetable oils. Now, of course, you say margarine. Well, they add some emulsifiers so that it actually essentially is more of a solid. In fact, they tend to saturate some of the margarine so that it'll hold together. But saturated fats are usually found more in animal products, unsaturated fats more in liquid oils and nuts and things like that. It was thought, of course, that Saturated fats are probably perhaps worse for you in terms of diet than unsaturated fats. That's still, we're not sure about that. In terms of, we get cholesterol from fats, but usually the dietary cholesterol, we don't get, dietary cholesterol generally does not end up in free cholesterol in the bloodstream. We usually get, that's almost completely, so you could probably take like butter, or eggs have a lot of cholesterol in them, and eat as much as you want, and if you actually look at your circulating levels of cholesterol in your blood, they would probably hardly budge. Okay, most of the cholesterol is actually made from your liver. The saturated fats, or the fats that you get from your diet, are probably used, the liver uses them to make the different things that the body needs. Okay? But it was thought that unsaturated fats were the best for you, generally, compared to saturated fats, and where people aren't sure about that. Here we are. We have all these carbons, right? And they all are bound to a single hydrogen. Now, unsaturated fats tend to have these side chains like this that are kinked, and so because of that, they stay liquid at room temperature. Okay, so saturated fats, they the carbons are bound to as much hydrogen as possible. So unsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats are not bound to as much hydrogen. They're liquid. Most plant food fats are oils and polyunsaturated fats. We can saturate, of course, plant oils. That's why where we get margarine. All we're doing essentially is we're adding hydrogens as side chains to the carbon. Now, partially hydrogenated, and in other words, hydrogenated means adding hydrogen, actually hydrogen ions, to the carbon, are called trans fats. Supposedly they're very bad for you. I don't know why. I'm not a nutritionist, but I don't even know if they know. Okay, unsaturated fats have health benefits. Recently, in the last year, there's been called into question whether they have more health benefits than saturated fats. But certainly, olive oil is a wonderful oil. You can use it for so many wonderful things. Nuts, they're great to just chew on. There's nothing wrong with that. Avocado is a fruit that's got a lot of unsaturated fats in it. So, saturated fats include a lot of the things that supposedly are bad for us. Cheese has a lot of saturated fat. Cheese is from animal products, right? Animal muscle, whether it's turned into sausage or my favorite, nice red ribeye, that's kind of what you get from then, and then there's a question of whether it actually increases your cardiovascular risk and diabetes and all that kind of stuff. There is certainly an association between, let's say, eating too much or having a metabolism that packs on the pounds and then ending up with this metabolic syndrome. That includes cardiovascular risk, diabetes, and other metabolic problems, okay? So, whether you should cut down on the saturated fats or not, I really can't tell you at this point. It doesn't seem like they're as bad as it was thought they used to be. Okay, cholesterol. Now it was thought that we get our cholesterol, a lot of it from the fats that we eat, and that, in fact, cholesterol was the problem for arteriosclerosis, where you get cholesterol in the bloodstream that then coagulates, forms plaques, clots, causes cardiovascular disease. Now, cholesterol is used in a whole bunch of other things, including hormones like testosterone. Testosterone is a combination of cholesterol and then protein, and an estrogen. I'm not sure if cholesterol is incorporated into insulin. I don't think so, but it's not water soluble. Okay, so if you think about certain things that are water soluble, sodium chloride, sodium and chloride, anion together, it's table salt, but you pour it into water, it's water soluble. Fats and cholesterol are not water soluble, so they don't tend to be solid in such a situation. And so perhaps it's responsible, it was thought, for plaques and other fatty acids that accumulated in our arteries. But that's been called into question, just so you know. And cholesterol is not, any excess cholesterol must be carried in lipid-based particles. So these are fatty particles that are surround cholesterol. Now, lipids are fats, essentially. But cholesterol, of course, is very important for a whole bunch of different things besides just causing plaques. But what happens is with cardiovascular disease, you have more floating cholesterol. Remember, it's not water soluble. And as we get older, our connective tissue and stuff gets less flexible. And apparently it accumulates in our arteries and causes these plaques that then cause eventually clots, let's say. And that's when you get an infarct. Let's say it's a heart attack, or if you get one in the brain, it's a stroke, something like that. Okay? It was thought that dietary cholesterol was part of the problem. But dietary cholesterol doesn't appear to be part of the problem, but certainly people who tend to put on weight tend to have more of these metabolic problems like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and whatnot. Interestingly, Eskimos and the Inuit up in the far north, they don't eat, as you can imagine, a whole lot of fruits and vegetables. It's frozen. So most of their diet is animal fats, whether it's fish, marine mammals, things like that. In fact, they often eat the blubber of whales and pinnipeds and things, just basically fat, and yet they don't have any sort of cardiovascular disease and diabetes that people, in the lower 48 have. So they're a population that appears to be adapted to living in the far north, where the diet is much, much different. And so they have alleles that allow them not to show all the negative consequences of metabolic disease that our society, modern societies, tend to show.
Like the lactose intolerance?
What?
Similar to the lactose?
Yeah, exactly. Now, of course, it turns out also, I guess, that cholesterol interacts with height, so Inuits tend to be, animals in northern climes or southern climes that are really cold, they tend to show body forms that are slightly different, so more rounded, less surface area to volume ratio, so they can actually hold on to heat and pour more easily. Okay. Now, fat and cholesterol. HDL and LDL. Let me see something. Hold on. Okay. Anyway, so formation of HDL, which is high-density lipoproteins, it can target excess cholesterol in the liver where it is recycled. Now, that's unsaturated fat. Supposedly, saturated fats promote the formation of low-density lipoprotein, which can deposit cholesterol into your lining of your arteries and supposedly clog. Anyway, if as you get older, they'll do, lipid panels and all that for you when you go into a physical, and they'll look at the level of LDL to HDL. It's considered, HDL is considered more beneficial, and LDL is more dangerous, let's say, because of cardiovascular disease. And so they usually look at the ratio. So you want to have high levels of HDL to LDL. If you don't, then they start feeding you these things called statins that are part of they interrupt the metabolic pathway in terms of producing these various substances. Okay. And then there's also triglycerides as well, which are, let me see something. Okay, carbohydrates. Sugar, simple carbohydrates. Potatoes, complex carbohydrates. Potato casserole. Brussels sprouts, less digestible complex carbs. In fact, these are actually what are called fiber. And apparently eating lots of fiber, you don't get very much energy out of them, but they're good in terms of keeping your colon functioning properly. Okay, now, the only kind of carbs that our cells can use is glucose, okay, and galactose as well. But these are very, very simple carbohydrates. Okay, now there are others that are what are they called? Hold on, let's take a look. Oh yeah. Okay, carbs. What are they? They're made of carbon and hydrate, OH. Okay? The composition of a carbohydrate is a multiple of CX, that's the carbon, and H2O, and then Y. And I'm not sure what the Y is. Okay. But anyway, there are different kinds of carbohydrates. The ones that we can actually use, that our cells can actually uptake and get energy from, are monosaccharides. Okay? That means, so this up on top is the glucose. I keep leaving, I think I'm giving you guys everything in, okay, so I'll go over here. Glucose and fructose. So, this is what a glucose monomer looks like. It's a monosaccharide. This is what the body cells can actually use. Yes?
Are monosaccharides fatty acids?
No. No, they're carbohydrates. A fatty acid is a fat with a lipid. So, there are three, there's proteins, fatty acids, and then carbohydrates.
Okay.
And then, vitamins and minerals and whatnot. Now, you can, fructose is also by itself a monosaccharide. High fructose corn syrup, but a lot of fruits have fructose in them, and it's a slightly different form of sucrose or glucose. Now, disaccharides, like sucrose, that's table sugar, is a combination of a glucose and a fructose. You can have others where it's just a bunch of glucoses all strung together. Okay? Lactose, this is the carbohydrate found in milk. You can actually only access it as far as an energy molecule if you have lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks it down into glucose. Okay, or galactose, actually. We'll look at that a little bit. So, the sucrose is a disaccharide. And then polysaccharides are long chains. Remember how we looked at proteins and amino acids strung together, they're peptide chains? Well, because this is all carbon-based life forms, carbons make these long chains in terms of chemical reactions. And so you can oftentimes stretch a whole bunch of basically saccharides together into a polysaccharide. Now, some of those polysaccharides you can actually turn into single monosaccharides like glucose, so they can use them in the cells for energy. So starch from potatoes or pasta, something like that. Now there's also the fiber that I mentioned too. Fiber are polysaccharides, but they usually do not generate very much glucose. They act more like fibers. And so, a high fiber diet keeps your colon clean. Okay? Let's see. Okay. Oh, fructose. Yeah, so you can have glucose and fructose all strung together. So complex carbohydrates. These are things that a lot of people love. Bread, pasta. They're polysaccharides. That means there's a whole bunch of simple carbohydrates or simple sugars strung together. So starch, like potatoes. Now Brussels sprouts have cellulose. Cellulose is a fiber. It's the fiber that you most commonly find in, in trees, the woody parts, or in the kind of stringy parts of, let's say, certain vegetables. Okay. Now, plants store carbohydrates, some of which are simple carbohydrates. So a lot of plants make fruits that are sweet. That sweetness is fructose. That's a very simple monosaccharide. Okay, but plants often, and that's to attract frugivores, or animals that eat fruit, that will then disperse the seeds. Okay, so normally though plants store their energy, the carbohydrates that they fix from photosynthesis, they store it in starch. And so oftentimes you'll have it in structures like potatoes and tubers and things like that. Cellulose, on the other hand, oftentimes you'll find in, broccoli, structures, above ground structures. Now, cellulose is indigestible dietary fiber. It's a polysaccharide. It's generally not digestible. You might think, well, why should we eat it? It apparently helps intestinal mobility. It influences our cholesterol balance. It slows down sugar absorption. Animals are not able, actually, we're actually not able to break down cellulose for the most part. So we can't get any glucose out of it. But a lot of animals have gut bacteria that can do the job for us. And so you think about cows and other herbivores, they have a whole suite of gut bacteria that actually break down cellulose into its simple monosaccharides, and they get glucose from it as well as we do too. So these are actually what are called symbiotic bacteria. Insects, termites are some of the most ubiquitous insects on the planet. They make these big mounds. If you've ever been to Africa, they basically eat, well, they eat wood, right? That's all cellulose, but they have bacteria in their gut that allows them to digest it. Now, so plants generally store polysaccharides either as cellulose, that's structural carbohydrates, or energy stores, as in starch. Animals store excess carbohydrates as glycogen, either in the muscles or the liver. Okay, so let's say we have a nice big meal of fruits. And let's see, it's a good one. Grapes are really full of fructose. So we eat a lot of those. We're not going to use a lot of that, so it's then eventually turned into what's called glycogen. And it's stored either in the muscles or the liver. When we need energy stores, that's where our energy stores actually come from. We start breaking down glycogen into simple monosaccharides like glucose that we can then use. Your brain can only use carbs, period, simple ones. And so, like glycogen actually has to be broken down before we can actually use it. Let's see, muscles, muscles have a lot of mitochondria. Now, mitochondria are the furnace that actually produce the energy for our cells to use so that they can carry out their functions. Because muscles tend to burn a lot of glucose, they usually have lots and lots of mitochondria. And so some of the glycogen that we actually have is actually stored in our muscles for rapid use. Our heart is a muscle. Okay, so there's glycogen stored there. Also, our liver, tons of glycogen is actually stored there. So when we exercise, the first things that we're actually going to use are these glycogen stores that are broken down by an enzyme into simple monosaccharides like glucose. Okay, metabolism. Okay, so anabolic. You've heard of anabolic steroids? So anabolic means synthesis of muscle or storage of fat. That means you're putting simple things together. In this case, in terms of muscle, you're putting the glycogen together or fat together. Catabolic means you're actually breaking those things down. So glycogen and fat usage, you need, those are done in the mitochondria within our cells. Those are little tiny organelles that turn our food stores into energy that our cells can then actually use. They require, if you actually look at the cycle, it's called the Krebs cycle, for breaking down and turning and getting energy out of glucose, it requires oxygen. So it's an aerobic metabolism and chemical reaction. You can also get some energy from non-aerobic conditions as well. That's the fermentation process. Okay. So now, if we run through all of our glycogen stores and fat, we can start catabolizing muscle protein. This is not a good thing to do. So let's say someone is going through a famine, or an animal is going through a famine. There's not enough resources, right? The first thing they're going to catabolize is their glycogen and fat stores. Okay. Then they're going to actually catabolize protein. But turning protein into basically glucose is a very inefficient process. And it's a very expensive process. So it's the last thing that you actually want to happen. Diabetics have the same problem, even though they often have high levels of glucose floating around in their bloodstream. They don't have enough insulin to help transport it into the cells to use. Okay? So essentially, a lot of diabetics, they don't have access to energy sources like glucose and polysaccharides and all that. It's not being transported into the cell, so they actually break down muscle tissue and turn it into kind of glucose stores that they can use inside of cells. And then you get a whole bunch of things like ketones, which are different kinds of organic chemicals that aren't very good things to happen. Now, in general, complex carbohydrates are digested slowly. They must be broken down into the simple sugars before our cells can actually use them. Simple sugars, like in these, they look like blueberries or huckleberries, something same family. Those can be broken down very quickly. The thing is, it seems like they used to say that a high carbo diet was good for you, and it doesn't appear to be that way anymore. So anybody who's eating mainly pasta and breads and things like that, well, first of all, you're not going to lose any weight that way if you wanted to. Actually, you lose a lot more weight if you have a high protein, high fat kind of diet. Okay, that's generally what the Mediterranean diet is. Doesn't necessarily mean lots of meat. It means lots of grains and vegetable oils, nuts, and things like that. Okay. Now, take a look at this. So, one of the hormones, or the hormone that we actually use so that our cells can uptake glucose, is called insulin. And they're released by one cell type. They're found in the pancreas called beta cells. And they act as signals to other cells in terms of allowing the uptake of glucose. So it's a small protein hormone produced by the pancreas that triggers cells to take up glucose via GLUT-T4, which is a receptor, insulin receptor, from the bloodstream. Insulin binds to a receptor right here, which starts many protein activation cascades. Okay, so there's a bunch of different chemical reactions going on. Here's the glucose that's being transported through this protein, glucose transporter protein number 4. And then once inside, the insulin can go down and take this glucose and turn it into many different sorts of things. So it can turn it into glycogen stores. It can turn it in straight into glucose that our cells can actually use. Okay, it can turn into glycolysis. Let's see. Oh, glycolysis is part of the cycle I mentioned about using aerobic respiration to turn glucose into energy. And then you can also turn it into fat, use it to turn into fatty acids. And so pyruvate is part of this cycle called the Krebs cycle. You don't have to know what it is. Okay. Now, glucose itself, it provides our energy stores, but it's not a form of energy we can actually use. What insulin does is gets it into this Krebs cycle process where we get something called ATP. ATP is what does all the work in our cells. So when you go through this cycle using this aerobic respiration, you get, for every glucose molecule, you get 36 or 38 ATP. If you only use a fermentation cycle, which is not part of the aerobic chain, then you get like 2 or 4 ATP. So aerobic respiration is much more efficient at generating ATPs, which are the actual things that the mitochondria use to generate things that cells need in terms of energy. And it's usually different ions, so that you have different gradients going from high concentration to low, things like that. Oh, I want to say one thing. Okay, diabetes. You all understand what diabetes is? There's two forms. There's a form where there's an autoimmune disease that destroys the beta cells in the pancreas, and so your body can no longer produce insulin whatsoever. Usually it manifests itself in childhood, and those individuals are required to take insulin the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, if you don't keep blood sugar levels really stable, if there's wild fluctuations, that's when you usually get the bad effects of diabetes. So you have, you tend to have problems with circulatory problems, and the kidney especially. Causes kidney damage, high glucose levels. Okay. There's another kind of diabetes called type 2. This is the kind that most people get when they get older. And they end up as part of this metabolic syndrome disease that incorporates obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, all that kind of stuff. Type 1 diabetes is the one that's an autoimmune disease. Type 2 diabetes is actually the result of evolution in action. And what I mean by that is that nowadays we live in a food-rich environment. We can get as many calories as we want. They're cheap calories, just go get them. In the old days, calories were the main thing that got you through a famine, right? If you had enough calories, you made it. The hell, whether it's a cheap food or a bad food, if they had calories, you're going to survive. Okay? Well, we live in an environment now that's saturated with calories. We never have to worry about getting enough calories for the most part. There are still parts of this planet where people have problems acquiring enough calories per day. Okay? In fact, it's called, what is it? Food? Anyway, not getting enough calories per day to actually meet your requirements. Okay. Now, if you have certain alleles that actually slow down your metabolism, get more out of each calorie, those are the kinds of, that's the kind of metabolism that will get you through a famine, a periodic famine. That also allows you to store a lot of those calories in terms of fat. So when there's times of plenty, you put on the pounds. When there's no calories around, you live and your skinny boyfriend dies, let's say, okay? Or vice versa. So you see these people running around that are, you know, all muscle and there's not an ounce of fat on them. They're dead, okay? I don't want you to feel like, oh, they're so lucky. Just tell them, look them in the face. In a famine, you're dead, okay? Now, unfortunately, if you have the alleles that make your metabolism more efficient at getting as much energy out of each glucose, in a food-poor environment, you live. In a food-rich environment, you get a phenotype, which is type 2 diabetes. It's called metabolic syndrome. In other words, you don't break down for amount of glucose. You actually get more energy. You don't use as many glucose as you otherwise would. You put it on you turn it into fats and storage and glycogen and things like that. And when you have an excess of that, it's not that your body is not producing enough insulin. Mostly, it's a matter of cells become insulin resistant. Okay? So there's enough insulin actually being made by the pancreas circulating, but for some reason the cells change and the receptors for insulin become fewer. The actual metabolic pathway about how that actually happens, I don't know if it's really been completely worked out, but that's basically what's happened. So you have cells, you might have a lot of insulin, but they're not using insulin efficiently. Okay? And so you end up with high blood sugar, which causes circulatory problems, among other things. Okay. Now, here we're talking about metabolic rate. There are some people who have a very high metabolic rate. These are the skinny people. Okay? They can eat and eat and eat and eat and eat, and they stay that way. Nothing is going to change that. Okay? Then there are people, it's not like, oh, high metabolic rate, it's a continuum, right? But at the other end, low metabolic rate, and that appears to be controlled by the food environment and the alleles that you have in terms of metabolism. Okay, so low metabolism, that's part of metabolic syndrome when there's a surfeit of food. There's way too much. You can get calories anywhere you want, versus otherwise not enough calories. Okay, so we'll leave it right there. Let's see, I'm going to open up a few more top hat questions that we've just dealt with here, and you can answer them on your own time. Okay?